thanks very much for coming along. It's really great to see so many people and wonderful artists, researchers and critics. So thanks very much, and really look forward to having a conversation with you. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Regent and I'm a researcher at University of Westminster with the CREAM, which is the Research Institute, research centre there. I'm also a writer and a photographer and a media artist. So just to give you a little sense of who I am. So I guess this project kind of came about really thinking through an extension of my book, Creole in the Archive, and thinking about the relationship between contemporary artworks and history and memory and past narratives. And so for me, it's really how do we think through the kind of methodology and approaches that artists are using to evoke a kind of past history. So for me, that's one of the reasons why I came to it. And of course, was really influenced by other artists' work, some of whom are in the room, like Chris Cozier here, and also from some of the films that you've seen, so people like Zineb Zadira, Ngugi Mutu, Keith Piper's work, for example. So for me, these are people who are really wrangling in very interesting ways with thinking about how to bring and evoke a kind of a past narrative into the present through contemporary artwork. So I just wanted to think about them as being distinctive and ingenious approaches, and how can we think about history and memory. And I wanted to just quote Trujillo, who's suggested that we actually participate with the past in at least two ways: through engaging with the facts of the matter as people thinking about history, and the other is the narrative of those facts, both what happened and that which is said to have happened. So he goes on, what matters most are the process and the conditions of the production of such narratives. So for me, artworks such as these, you'll be seeing, use various devices, forms, techniques, and wonderful imaginations to expose and make us consciously aware of the conditions within which narratives of the past are constituted. And I think that's really important for us to think about in the next few days. And so this is the exciting bit, and our persistent, and we're very interested in the persistence of this kind of type of artwork. So I'm going to hand over to my colleagues, Ashwani Sharma and Aisha Wahid, and they're going to say a few words as people who as my friends and colleagues who curated the film program predominantly for this evening that we're going to see. So, okay. Thank you.
Hiya, good evening. Good to see you. This is Aisha. This is Ash Sharma. In a way, it was Roshni's idea actually to begin the symposium in a sense with the films, and partly the idea was to centre artwork in relation to thinking about questions of history, memory, coloniality, the post-colonial. So the films are sort of, in a way, we sort of, I mean, I was going to say we didn't have a method, but maybe that's true, we didn't have a method, other than people suggested things and we looked at them and then we sort of tried to gain. I mean, these films are a very different range of films. Some of them are a kind of historical, sort of straightforward history, others about memory, personal memory, institutional memory. Some of them are more kind of about futurity and temporalities of different types. So they're not representative of the contemporary at all. They're all made in the last 5 years, which we thought was interesting in terms of, you know, many of us are a bit older. And this debate about archives and history and memory in terms of people of colour or diasporic or post-colonial have been doing it for a long time. So in one sense, the symposium and the network is an attempt to assess and evaluate and think through what are the debates now and how we can kind of think about a form of, think about the practice that's already happening, but how that kind of relates to broader questions, for instance, at the moment around the decolonial kind of moment as a critical term. And we're kind of quite interested in thinking through what historically has already been produced, but also what, at this conjuncture, what are the political imperatives to think about. And a lot of that will be tomorrow we'll talk about. And the idea is these films stimulate a set of ideas and thoughts they put in, which we can discuss. And our idea is to, so the idea is, what's it on? You want to go?
Yeah, no, just to add, because I think what we kind of looked through a lot of films, and I think what became apparent in terms of how we selected them was we were aware that there were so many other films that we could put in this, and a lot of artists working around this, but the way we put it together is that we wanted to reflect the range of practice, as well as the range of avenues that people were taking to address particular issues, and a reflection of geographical locations as well. And we thought there was beauty in putting it together in the show reel, because obviously part of tonight is launching an international network, and to be able to show these films together, I think it's a good prompt to thinking about the purpose of an international network. And that will be where we have afterwards an opportunity for people to talk to each other as well. Thank you.
I'll just say 1 minute. I mean, so the idea is it's a 2-hour program. One of our criteria was we could have shown 3 or 4 films, but we thought it was useful to get the diversity of different practices. So there's 13 films. Some of them are short, 5 minutes, and the longest one is, I think, about 16 minutes. Unfortunately, there was 3 films in the program, not unfortunately, but there's 3 films in the program which we really liked, but they were much longer. So Erica herself cut the film 16 to her film, but also there's 2 more that were quite long, so we just have done the curator's cut or something version of the film, right? So just because they were raising sorts of issues that we're interested in. And as Aisha said, so the idea is I had this idea, this is like a conversation, it's like a study session. You know, one doesn't need to be an expert on the cinemas of the films, and the idea is that we see the films and then we have a conversation about them in a kind of more general term, and then some of the more specific conceptual and theoretical issues will emerge, stimulated by today in tomorrow's session. The films are representative of a kind of the different practices, but they do indicate a sense of the diversity of, you know, aesthetic and kind of filmic practice in relation to questions of history, the archive, memory, temporality, and futurity. Right? There's things we're kind of interested in. I mean, the thing is, this is the first time Kieran and May have seen many of the films, I think. Maybe some of them. So it's the first time. We haven't rehearsed any of this, which is probably now a mistake. But anyway, we haven't rehearsed any of this. So, and we haven't really spoken about it. We just thought we'll sort of have a chat, and then we'll open it up to anyone else who wants to, probably got more sensible things to contribute than us. I don't know, I thought this first time I've seen all of them on a big screen, which is very rare to see some of these films, because a lot of them are either installation pieces, which you get in a gallery, and what struck me was the sound, right? The use of sound and various forms of, the audio tracks seem to be totally crucial to the way the aesthetics kind of work. But I want to just throw it out there and say, the other thing I thought was interesting, and I don't know whether we were interested in this, but it wasn't conscious, was the role of landscape. You know, the role, and it's maybe something about decolonization or the post-colonial, it is about time, but maybe it's also about place. It's about location, and those multiple histories. And landscape was interesting in that. But I think the third thing I would just say, and then you may want to ignore what I just said, but is really around, I thought they were deeply melancholic, actually. They were kind of mourning, right? In some degree. And not all of them, but we can come, I'm just going to put it the devil's advocate, that actually, if you go to the archive, you maybe can't get out. You know, the past, most of the films were trying to deal with quite difficult pasts, you know. kind of rendering what was maybe repressed or was too traumatic to represent. But so the question maybe to think about is with this mourning and melancholia, the landscape and the sound, whether they, I want to say maybe they're not, virtually all of them, they were quite beautiful as well in the way that they're produced, and maybe there's a seduction in the archive in a way. You sort of get to the archive and you get lost and you make these beautiful objects, but where's the hope? Yeah, I mean, is there kind of hope, right? So I don't know, now I'm throwing that out there, right?
I have the answer. No, I don't, but I think eventually this sort of free association that I'm going to make will touch on the point that you raised there about what to make of the tone of a lot of these works and melancholia or not. I thought where I would start is with a very striking line in Erica Tan's work, and I see that Erica is here, hello, which I think ties in very, very nicely with the overall theme of this research network and the conference, which is the question of the archive as method, and particularly a kind of method entailing artistic practice and artistic research. There's a line in the cut of the video that Erica shows which says the archive isn't really a site or an institution, it's a kind of method. I was very struck that by a lot of the really fine works that we saw, and that's a really interestingly put together program, and thank you very much, that where that method came into being seems to be vis-a-vis an artistic process of making whereby the artist, the starting point of that process is the artist closely watching and closely listening to the archive as media materials that we have so much of all around us. We don't go to institutions necessarily to access them anymore. They're around. So what was very interesting to me is a kind of recurrence of an artistic process whereby the making starts with watching and listening really, really closely, so that the artist is at the same time the listener or the watcher. And then what we see, I think, is a process of making as thinking, audio-visually thinking out loud. And what's interesting to me, as someone whose preoccupation with the moment of the third worldist moment, the moment of third world internationalism, that kind of latter half of the 20th century moment of artistic practice and revolution, then and now, what's really interesting to me is the question of how we trace a genealogy of the third worldist artist, of the southern artist. What's changed in terms of the position and the sense of vocation, responsibility, and what the artist does, what the artist has to do back then and now. And I think what's interesting here, implicit in the program that we've just seen, is an artistic position which in some ways seems more introspective, more small scale, maybe more melancholic, but it's really an artistic process whereby the artist makes work as a process of thinking. Quite differentiated from that historical revolutionary moment where the artist is the consciousness raiser, right? The sort of, in some ways, the organic intellectual, whatever you want to call it, the educator of a people whose consciousness has to be raised. I think that comes across really interestingly in this program here.
I think that's an extremely interesting point. I was, I think, similarly interested in the attention to the archive as being part of a critique of the archive or critique of the institutions that produce the archives. A lot of reflection on museums, a lot of artists physically going into the archive. We look at their hands as they flip through the documents. A lot of like zooming in on the physicality of different pages. I don't know, like a close attention to the textures of maps and those maps being superimposed on physical landscapes, these types of things. But so there's an attention to, there's a critique of institutions, and I guess I was trying to think about that in relation to an art historical idea of institutional critique. Because so a lot of the work is very reflective of its political and historical situation, as like post-colonial artists going back and either trying to uncover a history or figure out what happened, or to tell something that they know that happened, but try to find some type of official relic of the fact of it happening. Maybe not a lot. It's, I guess, a different idea of institutional critique than the critique of the art institution, and there wasn't a lot of emphasis on art institution. I wonder if part of that has to do with the fact that it's artist film and video, which I think has a different relationship to the gallery, but I was interested in the fact that what you mentioned, the transposition of a lot of our experience of this as films probably mostly, at least if the credits are any indication of anything, mostly made to be installed in a gallery space, where I think is a totally different kind of attention. And so I think that what you mentioned about the sound, I think, is really crucial, because to hear it loud, some of these works I had seen before, but I had seen them installed, and for the most part, I think either you just have like a private headset that you kind of dip in and out over these types of things, but it was nice to be kind of forced to reckon with these objects, like these artist films that are made in the context of a contemporary art gallery, but then being forced to engage them in the context of a cinema. But so yeah, I guess I'm also, I was just thinking about Onyeka's film, Her Name in My Mouth, as one of the, I was thinking about it as one of the pieces that does seem to have a certain reflection on its status as a certain kind of art object in particular, in that, and maybe also is one of the least melancholic of the pieces. It's definitely subdued in its affect, but in terms of it's about a certain situation of colonial violence, but mostly about a situation of anti-colonial resistance. So it's about the ABBA affair, which was like the women's war, and so it doesn't disclose, I think, most of this information, but the women's war was an incident in, I want to say in the 30s in colonial Nigeria. Or it's also known as the Women's Riot. Just like women in the Aba township kind of rising up. There's like this practice of like sitting on the men in terms of these like public humiliations of colonial administrators, then also property violence, or all the things that we associate with riots. But so none of that was really disclosed, and most of it's just like a meditation on ethnographic film. And I think it finds the ethnographic film really beautiful, and so it tries to isolate certain gestures and to repeat those gestures. And then I guess there's a moment at the end where the artist herself is doing a gesture, but it's not a gesture that we've seen. But I was just interested in the way that what it does is in the sequencing, but also in the really, I think, beautiful soundscape that gives some type of unity to the repetition of gestures or to the sequencing of scenes. I think it's that, I guess it connects the history of these gestures that are ostensibly ethnographic gestures being objectively recorded by the ethnographer. It kind of puts them in the history of photography or in the history of cinema, which obviously, and then those whole histories come from the history of gesture in the history of art. And so then art kind of becomes the mediating point by which you then, think that these ostensibly ethnographic gestures, and then that's the point from which the artist herself, and you can see her in the studio recording herself, reenacting a certain type of gesture. So it's just like, it's trying to get at the thing that is maybe like lost and then recorded, but then just in this, I think, nice acknowledgement of the complete mediation of that, and then the history of art as central to the history of this kind of colonial mediation.
I think, maybe it is difficult to sort of speak in the general about all the films, and if one closely looks at them, they're quite differently located in terms of cinematic history or art history, and you can see the practitioners come from different traditions. I was interested in what seems to be that, you know, the kind of voice and voiceovers, and the kind of, they're quite fragmented and quite subjective, and sort of some aspects of what you're suggesting, that some of it's untranslatable. You know, there's no attempt to, you know, even the claims in a couple of films to give you an authoritative discourse is itself challenged by another voice. The letter to Patarunga, for instance, that is like there's two kind of narrators contesting a certain kind of history. So I think one of the interesting things is those histories, that one of the acts of sort of the decolonial is not a response to the colonial or even an uncovering of something, but it's an experimentation in the way we can even write history. You know, it's a kind of it's questioning the very nature of the kind of history itself, and of course I think it is interesting that filmmakers from the South and diaspora have gone to things like the essay film and other forms of practice which draw upon certain historical narratives, but they kind of reposition the archive material. I think in earlier work, you know, someone like early John Comfort's work and Ida Dulins, etc., there was a kind of deconstructive practice going on. A lot of it was about undoing it, you know, just showing how it's colonial. And some of these films have that, but what seems to be also in play is a sort of a sort of kind of sense of a history as articulated through certain kind of subjective kind of voices, you know, through, not necessarily, I didn't think it was kind of about memory actually, some of that. It was kind of, it was linked to documents, right, the archive, but expanding the idea of what, as you were suggesting, what an archive is. It wasn't just an institutional archive, it was across the personal, etc. I suppose, I mean, I'm going to push the kind of this a little bit more, in terms of, in terms of, you don't have to answer this. So someone like Peter Osborne, who's quite a well-known philosopher of art, in his latest book, makes an argument, in a way, critical of this type of work, which maybe privileges a certain type of subjectivity and memory against something called, in historical materialism terms, an idea of history. The idea of history, in his critique, is memory is subjective, and in a way, then too individuated or fractured and fragmented. It doesn't offer us a kind of historical conscious raising, you know, and he sees history as social, political, and memory as not. I mean, he starkly says this. So I think there's something interesting about it not being revolutionary. You know, what's at stake? Even, you know, the early third cinema was political, radical, uses text, but there was a kind of idea of conscious raising. So I suppose I'm kind of interested in, is this a kind of register of, for instance, a diasporic filmmaker artist? In a way, they're also sort of rediscovering their histories, because I think a lot of the filmmakers I think are based here, right? Or in the West, right? Is that nearly true? But even if they're not, they kind of spend a lot of time here and then they're going back. So I'm trying to think about, and maybe there's a different project to locate a different, you know, someone else doing it in South Africa would have a different set of interests, you know. And the South African film we saw in Zulu was kind of interesting. It was very different. In some, I don't think it was very different, but in Zulu means morning, right? It means morning, and there's a kind of, you know, there's a kind of whole history in that body that has to kind of feels the pain and the layers of the skin coming off as accumulations of hurts in a way, and then having to put it back. So I suppose maybe it's very difficult to talk about them in the general, I suppose I'm saying, and whether, in fact, you know, the question of South Africa, for instance, can we really make sense of that if some of it's just untranslatable? Yeah, sure.
As a kind of detour around that point, and also to pause just a little bit longer on the two artist filmmakers that in the conversation that we've named, and I think it's very, very interesting and facilitators that we've named them, the two of them together. I don't think they're usually put in the same company. We've got Onyeka and we've got Trinity. So what's super interesting about the way that we've sort of instinctually named each of them, Onyeka's work, as you say, that register of what's illegible, what's gestural and what's untranslatable, that I think in the program that's the only work where we don't have subtitling in English, and also that work is explicitly reflexive about the question of women's historical experiences from that location. So how interesting that the two are put in a kind of relationship here. The illegible and women's historical experience. Trinity's work, which the kind of register of uncertainty, the subjective maybe or maybe not, or at least what its voiceover and its play of reflexivity there raises is a way of voicing an artistic speaking position whereby it's not the register of uncertainty, it's not a register of didacticism. It may or may not be subjective, but it's kind of inserting a feminine voice. What do you do with that? So I think the way that gender comes in via these two works is really, really interesting to think about, and maybe also to think about in response to that sort of a Peter Osborne critique. Is it really a question of, collective historical representation, collective experience versus the subjective and the personal? When we look at this from a sort of gender point of view, when we use women's experience and the female voice to sort of return to that old question again about how we represent, how we articulate artistically, then I think that either or becomes a bit more untenable, or at least a bit more problematic. So I think that's a sort of interesting thing to mull over here.
So I mean, I think this is, in a way, we've said quite a lot and kind of rich in terms of possibilities of how we may engage with it. So the idea is this is a kind of conversation. We're not the experts, so you don't ask us questions, but you may want to. So if anyone wants to say something, or some of the artists are here. I'm sorry. Yes, Erica is over there. Onyeka is in the front here, and I think is that right? Or someone else is hiding? No, I think that's it.
So, I thought that was fantastic. I'd love to hear you talk about it.
Maybe she'll get to. Does anyone want to even say? You don't have to engage necessarily with what we've offered, but maybe have your own kind of film that you saw was kind of interesting in terms of some of the things we've been trying to tease out. Yeah, sure. There's another mic.
Do I have to address you or?
Address anyone. But it'll be nice for people to say who they are. In a way, if we're trying to get a conversation, dialogue, hopefully we'll build that up over the day tomorrow as well.
Well, my name is Silvana. I come from Naples, and I've been in touch with Ash and many of the people here. And these are the people I want to thank, because I think that the idea of actually exposing us to this series of visual elements is already a very political act of intervening in the archive. And it's an experience that, I would really like to thank you for, because it's very rare, and it's already a very clear position in terms of what we can do with the archive. And then I can only say I was very surprised by Kit Piper's video, very refreshing, and also that he's telling us never to let the mic fall, because that's the moment when somehow reason slips. And I want let the mic fall, because actually I think that this has been very provoking for thinking, really intensively provoking. So I can only maybe give you my narrative out of the whole thing. I was very struck by Denise da Silva, Ferreira da Silva's and her partner, Serpent Rain, because I think that the voice that asks what can happen, what will happen of the human if narrated by the elements, is actually what makes sense to me of the whole process of watching this series of things. I was thinking that, for example, Sedira starts with the idea of the red ink, no? The element that actually is art, but is also the intervention in the cartography. And it's so simple and so impressive. No? The enclosure, but at the same time the marking of memory with simply a red mark, which is also the blood, which is also liquid. It's, you know, it's the memory of the father, whatever. Then there was this idea of the dust. What shall we do with the dust that maybe photographs will turn into with the effect of time? Then again, it was this idea of the landscape as relics. Relics comes back twice, and I will only mention something at the end. Then there was the cast. Again, a very nice play with words. The cast of a film, but also the casting of memory, what we can do with that kind of double meaning of acting and also remembering. Then stones, the stones with our heads, the wonderful sentence, when men die, they enter history, when statues die, they enter art. So it's death, but also this kind of metamorphosis that death can also imply. Flowers, the botanic garden, to me was very impressive, very simple, very poetic, but very strong. And then as also Ash was saying, the crusts, the skin, no, the peeling, unpeeling of. And this is what, in a way, also makes sense to me at the end. Well, of course, Onyeka and how we deal with excess. No, that maybe it's all these traces put together. How do we carry the burden of all this? I have only a memory of Derrida, who was so influential in the thinking of a new, different sort of archive. He said in a different paper that the only love we are left with, the only love, maybe even without we are left with, is for the ruins. That there is no other love but the love for ruins. And I think that maybe what can come out of this is to articulate this love. But it's also a burden that somehow the very last motto, who I think is really full of potentiality for science fiction, the future, whatever, she also indicates that, yeah, we can still dealing with the love for the ruins, but we can also at one point decide to unburden our shoulders from this, from everything we carry.
Hello, my name is Annele. I have a question for all of you. Sorry, I know you said no questions, but I want to ask you if you think creating interference is by nature disconcerting and disconnecting, because I found all of those films on some level to be disconnecting and disconcerting on a visceral level.
I think that's an interesting question. That will probably unpack a bit. I mean, I don't know if you understand. I mean, I think different readings of the same thing, right? So I think, and I think the question of audiences and viewing is interesting. Thinking about where they were made and who's for, and who's the audiences and stuff. It's all sorts of things to think about. Some filmmakers are very well globally known. They may be thinking through a complex history, and some are quite local artists. So I think there's some interesting things about what they presume about our understandings. So creative interference as an idea is one to question consistently, to think about art as something that questions. I think one of the things is that, I think one in which, and this is kind of simple, but the one in which it's not just about the West, and the end point isn't the West or the start. We have to disrupt that kind of way of, that narrativization of that history. But it's difficult because we're entangled in the West. And I think the other thing what's missing, and this is my being a lapsed Marxist, is only Serpent Rain really overtly talks about capital and capitalism, right? Which is kind of interesting. Maybe that's not fair, but maybe it's not ways. Maybe capital is so much everywhere you don't even see it. I mean, it's there in the last film, of course. The whole burden of, but I think that's interesting. And I think that's where Peter Osborne's critique comes from, I think. A very kind of historical materialist idea of capital's relationship to culture or something. But that's just me kind of thinking about the revolutionary conscious raising and what does that mean not to do that. Maybe that's not the role of certain types of filmmaking. Or it doesn't see itself, that form of it is not, yeah? And I think through the next day or so, we'll be looking at different forms of practices. Some that are maybe more closely aligned with social community life and those sorts of practices, and other forms of thinking about how these things get produced in certain contexts, and how they are actually quite determinant of the sort of form the work takes sometimes. So it's about, I think those broader institutional questions are sort of there, but they're not so overtly articulated within the forms of art. And I think that's partly to do with the art circuits, actually. That you can watch these things in isolation, in an art space, with quite decontextualized view. And some of the work works really well for that. But it sort of presupposes, it doesn't really, I don't know, maybe it's just not didactic, right? Maybe there is other art and we're not kind of looking at it that is kind of more revolutionary. Yeah.
Right. Hi, I'm Ginny Rawlings. Hi. One of the things that occurred to me, you were talking about history, and I think in one of the films it does disarticulate that, his story, and I think that's very important. But also that there, especially in Zillow and in the later films, that there is this sense of embodiment and the sense of history lived in the body as well. You've talked about the narrative voice, you've talked about the personal subjective voice, and I think that's as much revolutionary as anything else, that articulating those things through the body, through the voice, is as revolutionary, if you like. It's about turning things over. I say, it's turning over, transformative, and I think that's as important maybe as simple sort of Marxist critique of capitalism.
Thank you. Not really seen it back here. I just wanted to follow up on that. I remember actually think about affect really, and just how, and also really appreciate what you were saying about the embodiment of this. So I wouldn't necessarily separate out this idea of a kind of objective, kind of historical narrative, when actually within the archive, I think one of the things that a lot of these works expose are the exclusions and the different possible readings and the ways that you can, kind of put things together or kind of create new, like for example, in Erica's, like recontextualizing and often recollecting, Onyeka's work is recollecting this narrative of this women's war. She's recollecting it, and she's recollecting it. I think I would say something different to you about her being allured or finding the ethnographic beautiful. I think it's what it is doing. She's like evidencing these women, or evidencing that relationship to herself and to her own Nigerian heritage, but also the kind of relationship to this woman being able to articulate herself or to kind of position herself as a revolutionary character. And in the kind of creating of the T-shirt and the wearing of the wrapper, the kind of ownership of that kind of revolutionary position. So I'd also say that there isn't, let's also think about quiet revolutions, right? And in that might actually maybe be, if you take Onyeka's picture images as well, you've got these images of the everyday aliveness, keeping women, I would say pounding fufu or kind of whatever, they're that kind of alive, keeping revolutionary thing. So those are some of the things I would like to put in the room.
Thank you. Anyone else?
I have a quick one. I guess this is not preempting what I'm going to talk about tomorrow, but I think Ash, you've sort of set the ground about thinking about capital, and then I think moved through thinking about the perniciousness of capital, and I'm thinking a lot about creating interference to a certain extent, and the spatiality of that interference, both in terms of, I think something Barbara was just mentioning about recollecting or reanimating objects already captured in some ways and archived, but also the capitalist market of art, and the production of various forms of labor that are creating various forms of capital and flows. So I feel like there's almost a question that's not being asked when there's a question of these would have been shown in a gallery and then now they're shown in this space. The people who may not have seen them in the previous shows and now they're shown here. It's sort of what is the valence that happens as this material or even the urge moves in multiple spaces. And I'd actually ask, moves through multiple capitals to a certain extent. Because if Barbie's talking about affect, that affective charge might be quite different if you have paid for it than if it is freely broadcasted against the wall or you're walking through the market town and encountering it on the street. It doesn't necessarily have to be good or bad. I just think it might be different in terms of what people that exchange that might ultimately happen. So I guess I'm really pondering about interfering in spaces and what remains, I guess. We've been asked about this, I guess there's a question of ruins, but I'm really thinking about the remains in those spaces, and maybe it is a bit of affective charge, maybe it is the debts, maybe it is a whole set of things. But I hope we can continue to have these questions about capital and labor, because I think they're very charged in terms of trying to move through it and around them.
Thank you. Unless, does anyone else want to say something? Oh, Roshni, okay. I mean, I just want to say that that's quite a nice way of sort of ending. But you will have the last word, so I'm going to give you the last word. But that's Karen Salt, who's the keynote at 10 o'clock tomorrow. So it's a nice dovetailing, a sort of preemptive trailer for what's happening tomorrow. But
I was just going to add that I wanted to revisit the idea of melancholia again, because I think that there, you know, your point about disturbing and being visceral, I think that's quite different from the idea of having an overwhelming sense of melancholia from them. So for me, there was transformation occurring through the pieces that actually moved you from a very kind of past that we all know has that kind of deep melancholic space to something that actually moved on from it, and I thought that was quite an interesting way to kind of think about melancholy.
okay, I think we deserve a drink now. So in your little envelopes, there's a little shit says 1 free drink. Don't lose it. And so it's just out here outside is the reception and a sort of like a launch for of the network. Thank you very much. Thank you.